become NATO Secretary General at some point. So that's just kind of awkward, at least from my perspective. And there have been similar cases also connected to the Iraq War in the UK, where there's a very good whistleblower law in place since the early 90s, I think, which has been labeled as a gold standard, but surprise, surprise, does not touch on national security whistleblowing either. So in order to tackle this, the Council of Europe in 2015 has, in a report, given out the recommendation that national legislation on whistleblower protection should specifically include regulations for national security disclosures based on the so-called Schwane principles, which are a set of global principles on national security and the right for information, which have been outlined a few years ago with the help of the Open Society Foundation. And these principles stipulate that disclosure of classified information should be allowed if it refers to one or more wrongdoing from a very, very extensive list of wrongdoings or misconduct, among those criminal offenses, human rights violations, dangers to public health and safety and the environment. It also touches on data protection and consumer protection in some fashion, but I don't recall in detail in what context. They require a whistleblower to act based on grounds of reasonable belief that the information is true and also falls under the categories laid out. And also requires those whistleblowers to follow procedures for disclosures correctly, which requires, in turn, states to set up proper rules as well, including mandatory internal channels and external addresses, because in well-defined cases, external disclosures should be possible as well. And while this has been, at least in the civil society community and among even, apparently even in the, at least in the Council of Europe, been widely accepted that this should be the modus operandi, there's very few laws that actually incorporate these principles. And in Europe, it's only one, that would be the recently introduced Irish Public Disclosure Act from 2015, which dedicates an entire special section on national security and establishes a so-called prescribed person where whistleblowers can turn to, who would be appointed by the Prime Minister. So, but that is basically the only context where there is a explicit, well thought through and specified procedure for whistleblowers to disclose information and nevertheless be protected. Thank you.
Yes, I need a microphone. Thank you very much. I was a broadcaster in a former life, but too many panels at this conference and I've forgotten. I need a microphone. Thank you. So as Loic said, my name is Paz Eddy. I'm a journalist and researcher from Australia, about to join the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. And I want to talk to you today about a major study I did. In fact, can I get you to pass me about half of those so that they don't all disappear, because I do need some of them for the other session I have to go to. And this study was commissioned by UNESCO in 2014. It was published on World Press Freedom Day last year, so it ultimately became a 3-year labour of love. And it examined the threats to the source protection frameworks that exist around the world in 121 countries, in fact, and it did a review of a 10-year period. Importantly, we acknowledge, of course, that a subset of confidential sources that journalists rely on for particularly investigative reporting is whistleblowers. And one of the findings that I'll come to, which is very critical to this discussion, is that there needs to be an interaction and recognition of the need for that interaction between whistleblower protection laws and source confidentiality laws where they exist internationally. So I'm just going to run through some of the key findings and actions from this study, because I've been at this conference for 2 years in a row talking about its imminent release, and this is the first time where I'm actually able to say it's out. You can read it and to run through some of the findings. So just to provide some context, and please forgive if these slides are balked, because I was fighting with my laptop before I arrived, which is why I was late. So I expect something to go hideously wrong, but just pretend it's all part of the show. So we start with this idea that journalism is in its golden age now. I mean, if you think about the massive data dumps, courtesy of whistleblowers, and this is an example from the Panama Papers, of course, which relied on collaborative global journalism networks, like in this case, the the ICIJ, the International Centre for Investigative Journalists. I always forget the definition of that acronym, which is essentially a clearinghouse for confidential information. And you will recall, the people in this room, I'm sure, that the whistleblower, in this case, demanded communication with journalists through heavily encrypted forms. So this was pivotal to this information coming out, this recognition. We also have a reality, no pun intended with reality winner up here, but we have a reality that while in many developed democracies, especially in the EU, we have a very strong tradition of legal frameworks to protect journalists from revealing their confidential sources in the interests of preserving the right to freedom of expression and the right to know, and also the right to access information, and also the right to privacy, which many journalists forget is utterly fundamental to their ability to do their jobs. As much as tabloid journalists can be fairly critiqued for breaching privacy, if you want to talk about the Murdoch situation with the so-called phone hacking scandal, fine, but we're talking about the potential for international privacy law to support investigative journalism by enabling the protection of communications between sources, whistleblowers and journalists. But we fast forward to an era in 2018 now. This is apart from a story about Aadhaar, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is a massive threat and risk in India, which is, I think we're up to 1 billion users are essentially enrolled. And it started as a process designed theoretically to gather digital information to help deliver services to Indians, to try and bridge some of the gaps around access to services for the poor, for example. But it involves fingerprints, names, addresses, emails, phone numbers, and I'm searching for the term to describe iris reading because I'm having a brain snap, but when they so scanning your iris in your eye. So biometric security is the term that I'm looking for. I found it, thankfully. So that has all been bundled together and effectively outsourced to private companies to administer. So you have this massive data collection going on at the same time as we have this extraordinary period of golden era investigative journalism. And then you have the story that many of you will be familiar with from just a year or so ago. Reality winner, who was a whistleblower inside the National Security Services, if I'm remembering correctly, within the US. I can't recall instantly which agency. But she was the confidential source, and we know this now, for The Intercept, which is the gold standard for contemporary journalism doing work with confidential sources and whistleblowers. And unfortunately, when they uploaded the documents, the original documents, to their website, good practice and principle in mind, they did not adequately neutralise the telltale signs of the documents. And my journalist, non-technologist interpretation of what happened is essentially the fingerprint of the document was revealed and able to be analysed, and they tracked her within hours as the source. So my point is that we can talk about the legal protections for sources and whistleblowers that exist internationally, but as this study found, and many others have commentated since and before, we're in an era where you may not need to rely on the very valuable legal protections that exist because you may not end up in court saying, I will not reveal my source as a journalist, because the security services or some very powerful corporate actor have enabled the discovery of your source through a combination of targeted surveillance, mass surveillance, data mining, data interception, metadata handover, and so on. And so this becomes a very frightening reality. And who was just in the Jim Risen talk at lunchtime? It's a shame you missed it. Some of us were. Go and find it and read about his experiences of being an investigative journalist across several decades. So he is the journalist who stood up in a most impressive and important way to the Obama administration over several years when there was an attempt to force him to reveal his source, and he gave a talk at lunchtime here. So I'll come back to that in a second, but he said something that I think is pivotal to this discussion, which was that now as a journalist, to do your job, you are inevitably, if you're doing your job properly, you are inevitably being spied on, and that means that you have to act like a spy in order to do your job. So you use counter-espionage techniques to be able to defend and protect yourself, right? I know, it's sort of a frightening prospect. But let me talk about this study so that we have some context. And I have no idea of the times. You'll just have to shut me up when you need me to be shut up. Okay. So this is the essential finding, that it's just much harder to protect your sources in the digital age because of these realities. And that's a global trend. So this study, we looked at 121 countries, as I said. Over a decade's worth of data was analysed. You can see some of the metrics there that demonstrate the robustness of the research. These slides are published online, and here's the example of balking of my slides. But just assume each of these headlines is as important as the other. That's why they're all called number one. So the legal frameworks that support source protection are under threat, at risk of erosion, restriction, and compromise. This is a UN-endorsed publication, bear in mind. I think that's important to note. And we're seeing a direct challenge to the universal rights of freedom of expression and privacy as a result, because of that connection to the sustainability of investigative journalism, because it's being eroded. And this is a really important recommendation, that journalistic communications with sources should be shielded from targeted surveillance, data retention, and the handover of material pertaining to confidential sources, which could arguably be extended to whistleblowers and work in tandem with whistleblower protections. And it all intersects around the theme of this panel, which is national security overreach, essentially, and the ability to try and protect your sources in that context. So what we found is that national security, and often that's conflated with anti-terrorism legislation in the West, is justification for eroding whistleblower protections and source protection. And we're saying, therefore, that there needs to be substantial renovations of laws. I won't go through all of this because I want to get to some of the recommendations before Loic forces me to stop talking. But suffice it to say that while in the West, the risks for whistleblowers and journalists in some instances doing stories that are highly contentious, the risks might be a loss of employment or financial impunity of some sort. The risks globally extend to death and assault and really serious harassment. So there are serious consequences here. Journalists are frequently either saying we need urgent upskilling in digital safety training, on digital capability in terms of defence techniques, and I can talk about that in the question about what I've observed professionally about that, or they're going back to what they call analogue basics, or going back to basics. So they literally, in the many interviews we did for this study, serious investigative reporters talking about driving 3 hours on dirt roads to avoid detection, because even saying I'm going to meet in a dark car park with security cameras everywhere doesn't necessarily cut it. So we heard a lot about that. There's an 11-point framework in this study that we hope people will start using to road test the capability of their own country's normative and legal frameworks to do the job of protecting whistleblowers and confidential sources. So let me just move to outcomes, and they include recognition at the full conference of UNESCO, and in fact in December, recognition at the full body of the UN of the need to specifically improve protections digitally for source confidentiality, and whistleblowers are referenced in that too. So that brings me to the pamphlet that you have access to, which is a new project that Blueprint for Free Speech has initiated, which actually is a lovely seg from this study, because one of the recommendations here is that NGOs and journalists should collaborate to ensure the empowerment of journalists in terms of digital security to enable better protection of whistleblowers and confidential sources. This project is about trying to develop a set of guidelines, about 20 guidelines that are clear and well-based, that will allow journalists to do better practice in this area. So it's essentially 10 principles, best practice principles for working with whistleblowers. So I did another presentation on this at another session, and you can read about it when I write about it online. But please take those pamphlets with you, and note that there is a survey online which I've just shared on Twitter, reluctantly, because I'm afraid of the repercussions of doing that. But we want journalists and people who support journalists working with whistleblowers to take the survey to make sure this is a really robust process. So I'll leave it there and you can unpack that.
Perfect. So that's a really nice transition. I'm a developer. I write code. That's all I know how to do. And I came to realize, I came to understand that Edward Snowden and the other whistleblowers are not criminals. I think they are heroes, and most people think that, but I came to realize that also the state and the lawmakers think they should do what they do. So to give you an example, when you have an intelligence agency, what are the means to verify that they do not cross boundaries? They're supposed to do everything in secret. So by definition, you cannot check unless a whistleblower goes and says, oh, this is wrong. So there is societal acceptance from the public, from the lawmakers and the states. 20 principles, the Council of Europe, everybody recognized that we should have that, but we don't. So Julie observes that we don't. Veronika advocates that we should have that. It will be a decade before it actually happens. So in the meantime, me and other people, are developers, we build tools to help them make their civic duty so that they can be whistleblowers despite this very sophisticated surveillance where we'll all have a mobile phone here. So the state essentially knows that we're together here. So what I do is I work on SecureDrop. And SecureDrop is a system that is designed to allow sources to communicate with journalists and protect their anonymity and do that really securely. And I'm proud of the work that I do. I spent day after day, and there is another one in the room who does the same thing. Day after day, I polish this little software in the hope that maybe someday a whistleblower will remain anonymous instead of not, and it will save her or him from years in court. They will win. Obviously, they will win because they're the good guys. But years in court, we don't want that for them, for anyone. And SecureDrop is the only system that is specifically targeted for these poor people who have no legal protection because they have classified documents, and if they are caught, they're automatically judged, and yeah, it's the end of the game. So let me give you an example of what SecureDrop contains to do that. It's called an air-gap machine. So who heard about air-gap machines? 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, big, but most of the people don't. It's a machine that has never been connected to the internet. How is it interesting? It's actually very interesting because you know about malware. Malware, imagine a source does not send you a document. They send you malware. So on the machine where you work, if it's air-gapped, the malware will own the machine and take all the documents and send them to the internet. Oh, no, it can't because it's not connected to the internet. That's interesting to be air gap in this. It makes them immune to malware. Even better, this is a machine that is live. That is, all the modifications are not stored on disk. It's stored in memory. So when you shut it off, it forgets everything that happened in the past day. So even if the malware sneaks in a corner, then it will be removed. So that's the kind of security you want when you're a journalist and you want to effectively protect the source that sends you classified documents. So you say, okay, I'm a journalist, I want that. Unfortunately, it's something that is really complicated and it's only one piece of the puzzle. At the beginning of the session, I asked you a few technical questions about security concepts, and it's overwhelming, really. Should we all learn that? No. Temporarily, we need to understand that better. Eventually, Veronika and Julie will make it so we don't need to because the law will protect these whistleblowers. So we're in a kind of interim situation there. So it so happened that we now, and you as journalists, you need to learn that. It will take a lot of time for that to happen because it's complicated. But you have good trainings for that. The Freedom of the Press Foundation in the US provide trainings to news organizations, journalists. In France, you have Nothing to Hide, which is a nonprofit, and you can go to them. I suppose Hermes Center also provide trainings in Italy for journalists. If you say, okay, maybe I don't have money, but I would like to learn, you go to Giovanni and he will find a solution for you. So the learning process is here. The journalist is not left alone. It will take a long time, and maybe we just have to wait until we all learn what encryption, end-to-end encryption, OTP, and whatnot means. But I'm a hacker. So when I have a problem like that, oh, it will take years before we can actually protect these sources, I want to crack it. I want to find a shortcut. Most of the time, it's a complete waste of time, and well, but that's who I am. In this case, we found something. So we have 3 facts. First, most of the documents that the sources send via SecureDrop do not actually need the level of protection that SecureDrop offers, which it stands to reason. Second fact, when a SecureDrop user makes a mistake, because SecureDrop is too complicated, they actually compromise the source, the security of the communication. So this is a very important concept. You can only use the security that you understand. If you do not understand the security measures, then don't use them. Otherwise, you will end up in the ridiculous situation we've seen in every movies where you have passwords that are too complicated, you end up writing it on a piece of paper and stick it on your computer. So this is the perfect example
and
of...
not over the camera where it should go.
Yeah, exactly. Have you seen Player One? That's a good, Player One, the movie, again. So SecureDrop is not immune to that. You have complex mechanisms, so you can fail them. So that was the second fact. Third fact, it is impossible to make a system that is both simple to use and extremely secure. There's no way. It's a trade-off. You have to choose. And from these 3 facts, there is one idea. We don't try to make one system that is both. We take 2 systems, and we let the journalist and the source choose which one to use, depending on the context. So if I'm a source, and I come to, say, the New York Times, and I want to send a link, and it tells me, here is where you can send your link. But if you need SecureDrop, then you go there. If I'm a source and I have no clue what SecureDrop is, it means I do not understand the security that it offers me. And it doesn't matter that I don't use it, that I use the less secure mechanism. And most importantly, then, most of the submissions will come to the journalist through a simpler mechanism, and the security will be much better. So we're implementing that now, and if you're a journalist, you're interested in participating, testing it, come to me and we'll talk and we'll try. I will give you something. So that's what I do in order to help these national security things. And we are done with the presentations, and now we have about 20 minutes for questions. So we prepared questions for each other in case you don't know what to ask. But it's really, now you can ask questions, and we will ask ourselves questions. Who wants to start? Yes, here.
Yeah, are there indications that the whistleblower laws will change, or is there any country? I mean, you outlined a whole bunch of them that do have whistleblower laws, but especially for classified information, or is that just sort of like a dead heat?
For the time being, probably yes, yeah, because so as I said, so yeah, the legal initiative that we're expecting from the European Commission next week is mostly not going to touch on it in specific. So it might go into the, we need special procedures for that, but which already is good anyway, right? So if you if you look at the Irish law and you have one specific person, or you can go to a minister, and there at least there's awareness for the issue that, or classified information might have to be disclosed at some point, and that at least the state is open to it. That's probably a step forward, but I think that is all we can hope for the time being. And I mean, I don't know, there's another law in Spain that's being discussed, which overall looks pretty shitty, but kind of goes into the same direction. So says maybe they should introduce something on national security. It's all not very specific, but overall, I think slowly the situation is improving.
I have a very interesting question. Assuming that we live in a civilized world, I know that intelligence services, for example, in many countries have more sophisticated methods of persecutions of whistleblowers. And as for me, I know I'm from Russia, and I know of a lot of cases, fabricated criminal cases, just whistleblowers were accused of fraud, for example, of corruption, but what they didn't do, I know for sure, they're honest people, but they are whistleblowers. They did that, and afterwards they were accused of fraud and put in jail for 10 and 15 years. How do we protect those whistleblowers who were put in jail, were accused of something that they didn't do?
So in this case, you have nonprofit like the Courage Foundation, who will provide them with legal help, financial help if they need to. But for that to happen, they need to reach out to this nonprofit. That's one idea I have.
I mean, there are also really important organisations like the Committee to Protect Journalists. UNESCO does a lot of work in this area in trying to get legal change around, and if not legal and state-oriented change, then activism within countries to support the release of jailed journalists. And arguably there's a case pertaining to whistleblowers as sources of journalism too. I think my response to that is, at a conference full of journalists, that one of our biggest responsibilities is to, what we like to say in newsrooms as report the shit out of it. I'm sorry about my, not French, but crass English. But genuinely, if you want to be able to defend your ethic of protecting your sources / whistleblowers you're relying on to reveal information in the public interest. It is not belly gazing at your own profession to be reporting in the public interest on the issues that affect whistleblowers. And I think that's something that we have to work on. So what I'm saying is, you can use the civil society organisations that do exist, and Article 19, which is an amazing organisation that does great work in this area. There are various, Blueprint for Free Speech. You've got various other whistleblower networks, but journalists have to get an understanding of the risks for whistleblowers, and their own practice needs to be improved to enable protection of those whistleblowers. And the third prong is they have a responsibility, I would argue, to report on these issues as they are manifested. Before we take another question, can I tell my Edward Snowden story?
Sure. Yeah.
I just realised, I don't know why, but I forgot to give you my anecdote. So I published this study and tweet about it because it's my practice. I'm a journalist, I put it out there. And I'm talking about it on the radio and, being interviewed, and it's all great, and journalists are actually paying attention. And then suddenly I'm walking around doing a million things at once as usual, and my phone starts pinging incessantly, and Edward Snowden had retweeted this study, and this is genuinely the first time that a UN study that is relatively impenetrable for a person not interested in this stuff went viral. So I tried to tell my mum this, right, thinking this is extraordinary. I have been slaving on this study for 3 years, and Edward Snowden has tweeted it. This is like, my life has been made. And my mum, who I'd just cooked dinner for, and I'm going, isn't that exciting? She said, who's Edward Snowden? And I think, this is, she's not living with me, but it's something I'd been discussing for months, right? Years.
But you live in Australia, that's right.
Well, at the time I was living in Paris, but...
My name's Elysia Folkman. I'm a freelance journalist based in Tunis. We've got I'm trying to shrink down the question, because we have a massive issue in terms of protecting whistleblowers. There are a lot of freelance corruption investigators, and a lot of them approach me because I think I have a nice welcoming face. But when they describe things like their document securing or complete lack of security around that, there's a desperate need for training, and for all the rhetoric in Tunis about freedom of press and democracy, it's becoming more and more corrupt, and it is a complete nightmare. I mean, it's to the extent that it really could tank the country over the next 2 years. So my question is, particularly a lot of the corruption is transnational, is how can a freelance like me, who's not working with a big organisation, work to protect and educate and secure, particularly a lot of it's literally a paper trail. I do know some digital researchers, but they're just one team. But most of the corruption researchers are putting together paper documents, and they never once think to scan and upload and have duplicates. And if I hear, I was researching this for 2 years and then the documents got stolen one more time, I think I may scream. So it's how to train people in a way that also doesn't flag things up. Thankfully, Tunisia's online surveillance is quite crap. But at some point, the Ministry of Interior might have a little epiphany and ask the bigger nations to teach them how to do it. And we dread the day. But we in terms of protecting sources, I mean, this year we've had 4 or 5 foreign journalists, certainly the European journalists and also Egyptian, Jordanian journalists arrested, as well as local journalists being, in the past there have been local journalists up in military tribunals. But actually 2 of my colleagues have been pressured to surrender their connections. One was even subpoenaed and dragged to the head office of the National Guard. So we are in a much worse situation than we were 2 years ago. So it is...
So sad.
Yeah, it is. It's incredibly sad.
I have one suggestion. I mean, in every country you have hackers. And there are people who have a lot of time on their hands. They usually don't have any money problem because being computer savvy, you make a living. And so they can be helpful. And reaching out to them and not asking them for a solution, but explaining them the problem. So the core of the hacker is solving problems. They cannot stop until they solve the problem, or they will keep going. So you need to find maybe someone, they will train you, they will solve some problems. It's not, yeah.
Sorry, this sounds very negative, but a lot of North African hackers, as you say, don't have money problems. And I know of perhaps one who isn't, no, he is fairly bent. He is quite good at copying bank cards. There is a security risk with North African hackers. They're very, very adept.
Okay, I should define what I mean by hacker. A hacker is someone who has a playful mind, not someone who breaks the law. So I'm referring to hackers are people who are good with computers, not people who break the law. And do you know, as a hacker, how many times I've been approached by journalists in the past 30 years, them asking my help? Zero, never happened. In the past year, I went to dozens of journalists offering my help. A handful even answered the mail. So I'm not saying that to say, oh, I'm bitter, I'm so sad. No, on the contrary, I'm saying there is untapped energy there. If you go there, you will find help, really. Another question, yeah.
Hello. I'm Giovanni, and I work at Pellerano, and I work at the Hermes Center. I'm the person that Loic Dachary was mentioning. And while listening to your talk, I was wondering, you told that it doesn't exist any law in place for protection of whistleblower, that specifically on the topic of national security. And I was wondering if you have already evaluated what is the impact of the others law in other fields on the topic of national security. In this, I'm referring, for example, you mentioned the Spanish law. In France, there is Sapanda. In Italy, we have, since 2012, a law that protects whistleblower in the field of anti-corruption in relation to public agencies, where the employee can report about corruption and be protected. And as well, this law in November has been extended to the private sector. This can have an impact even in the national security whistleblowing, because there are national security actors that are public agencies or that are strictly related to enterprises. So actually, there is some effect already coming there as side effect.
Sure, and these are like the good cases.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. But in general, the problem is that, so as these laws are usually not fully comprehensive, you find loopholes and, you know, many whistleblowers, let me think. I mean, for example, in France, they still have to go to court to prove their case. Like, it's not just because there's a law, you get a pre-exempt whistleblower status and nobody can touch you. That's not the case. You just have a stronger base to go to the lawmaker after the fact and say, wait, that wasn't cool. But whenever national security isn't explicitly dealt with in those laws, and I'm not sure about Italy, but I don't think it is. Plus, it's only like it's very narrow to like down to corruption, and then this kind of fuzzy public integrity thing. you know, it always provides a basis for judges to say, no, actually that's not covered. And if you make a stronger case for the necessity to protect interests of the state, you know, then you have like one guy standing next to the full power of the nation state, where, you know, like, what are the odds that the small guy wins? So I don't know whether that answered your question. Or, by the way, I have to correct myself. I just remembered afterwards that the Spanish law now doesn't actually, the suggestion that's on books would not cover this, actually. I got that wrong. Okay.
Maybe we get to ask one question to each other, because we, unless someone has a pressing, really interesting idea. Okay. Let's go on.
I might ask you my question, because it goes to your question about assistance and the things that you might be able to do at a starting point. So my question is to Loic, and I'll just do a 10-second preamble, maybe 30, that I've just spent 2 years back in industry in Australia after this book was finished, working for Fairfax Media, which is a big national news publisher. And I was responsible, among other things, for training and development. And I tried assiduously to get capability boosted around digital safety and security, very strong investigative teams, for example. And it wasn't easy to get people interested and to get people to commit, although there were several individuals who were excellent at it. So my question to Loic, because the response was, it's too hard, it's too clunky, it takes too long, I can't be bothered, I just need the story. What are the top 3 things that you think a journalist should do, and 3 easy solutions for a journalist to take right now, right here, to better protect their sources and whistleblowers?
I'll be very practical. The first thing you can do, and it's really easy, is to run away from Google Drive, iCloud, and Dropbox. So how do you do that? You go to a website which is called indie.host, and you create an account. It's free.
What's it called?
Indie.host.
I-N-D-I?
Yes, like indie movies, indie host. So it's super easy to do that. So there you can, one thing you can do, and you do all the time, oh, I want to share a document with you. So instead of going to WeTransfer or Dropbox, you go to IndieHost, you upload the document there, and you share the link with someone. That gets you started. But the best thing is, it's just the beginning of the story. After that, you will be able to activate more interesting things. You only have 50 megabytes for free. So if you get hooked to that, you can say, okay, I want 50 gigabytes there, and it will cost you. Yeah, because iCloud, and it does not cost you. Well, actually, it costs you. It's hidden. But in the case of IndieHost, you actually have to pay money. But it's €2 per month. So that's the first thing. You get to use the thing, and then you learn how to pay instead of paying with your private data. So that would be one thing. The second thing is you talk about it. You talk about your experience. You do not say, people should do that. You say, I did that. I'm a journalist. I did that. I succeeded in doing that. I failed in doing that. To get the word around. And third would be you, and it goes again to what I said, you talk to tech people. What I do for journalists in France, and also nonprofits, and also all the people who are not tech savvy, I spend a significant amount of my time helping them find solutions that are practical. And when they tell me, no, it's too complicated, or if a month later they tell me, I don't use it after all. So here is an example. A journalist told me, I have a very, very sensitive topic. I'm finishing my book. I will use Tor only, so I cannot be traced, etc. And he was very determined. We installed it on his computer, his mobile phone. We tried it. He was pumped up. 2 weeks later, we met again, and he was not using it. See, it's too complicated. And anyway, I'm connecting to Facebook, so what's the point? So having, with a tech person, having that kind of conversation is essential. Does that answer?
It does. It's the follow-through that's problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
Tor's great, except we're in a country where using Tor is illegal, i.e. Tunisia, yes. Egypt. Yeah,
oh, so you actually, when you download the Tor browser, it can hide itself as something else. So it can pretend to not be Tor, but be something on Google Drive. Really, it can do that. So you're not trapped.
Thankfully, again, cybersecurity in Tunisia, the laws are restrictive, but as I say, at the moment, their cyber hacking capabilities are fairly low, and I have that from people in foreign security agencies. The other thing, I do try and get people to use VPNs, but I have a little bit of a concern about package VPNs, TunnelBear and CyberGhost,
yep.
And which is the most secure and hideable, and actually you can program, because
good security comes when you don't have to trust anyone. If you use a VPN, you have to trust your VPN provider. When you use Tor, you don't have to trust anyone. So that concludes. Thank you very much for a lot of really good questions.
Most of them in the context of the Iraq War. There's been one very sad case of